So, you have an interview coming up with a deaf person. If you're watching this DVD, the chances are you've not been in this situation before and you're considering the implications of using an interpreter. This DVD is designed to let you know what to expect when working with a British Sign Language interpreter, as well as teach you some basic etiquette and dispel some commonly held myths. Before going any further, it's worth checking that the person coming for the interview actually requires a British Sign Language interpreter. Not all deaf people use British Sign Language and may require other types of professional communication support. The easiest way to establish this is to contact the interviewee and ask what their preference is. If a sign language interpreter is required, contact the HR department and they will give you the details of an agency that can provide you with a qualified interpreter. Please note that booking an interpreter will generally take about 2 weeks. While the purpose of this DVD is not to teach you about sign language or about deaf people in general, it's useful to clarify what it means when we talk about British Sign Language, which is also known as BSL. British Sign Language is, as the name suggests, a distinct language in its own right, and not just a gesture system or signed version of English. This is important to bear in mind when we consider the other points made later in the presentation. Before I can describe what sign language interpreters are, it's important to clarify some things that they aren't. A common mistake is to think of the interpreter as a kind of translation machine or robot, where they simply take in one language and unthinkingly send out another.
Hello.
Another misconception is that the interpreter should act like a chameleon, simply blending into the background and being as invisible as possible. As stated before, British Sign Language is very different from English, and the interpreter will be continually making sure that all participants are communicating effectively. This means their job isn't simply a passive one, and it also means you are likely to be very aware of their presence. It is best to think of the interpreter as a participant in the interview who is not aligned with either yourself or the interviewee. They are not there as an advocate or helper for the disabled person, they are there purely as a communication expert for the user of the minority language. They are there just as much for you as they are for the deaf person, and you should make full use of their communication skills. It is worth using the time before the interview to think about what additional considerations may be raised by having an interpreter present. Consider whether it will be beneficial for the interpreter to have a list of questions to be asked in advance. This can help them prepare for any difficult concepts or jargon. Do try and keep this information as brief as possible, however. Consider where the interview will take place. Is your normal interview room big enough to accommodate the addition of an interpreter? Ideally, the interpreter should be positioned as close to the interviewer as possible so that the deaf interviewee can easily switch attention between the two. Also, avoid placing the interpreter close to or in front of any windows, as this can make it difficult for the deaf person to see them. As previously stated, it's important to realise that the interpreter is there to facilitate you just as much as the deaf person. It would be of benefit to all involved if you have a discussion with the interpreter before the interview begins. This can include topics such as the interpreter's requirements, the structure of the interview, and to clarify any job-specific jargon. As the interpreter is a participant in the conversation, don't be surprised if they interrupt you to clarify something, or check that something they have interpreted has been understood. The correct etiquette is to direct your questions to the deaf person rather than the interpreter. This means facing the deaf interviewee and also phrasing questions in the first person. For example, would you enjoy working outside? As opposed to, can you ask him if he would enjoy working outside? It's important to realise that interpreters will generally voice over in the first person, and this should not be confused with the interpreter giving their own views. Interpreters are bound by certain ethical codes, which means they are not able to provide their own opinions on discussions even when asked for them. While it is perfectly acceptable to talk to the interpreter directly, be aware that it is impolite to do so if you do not want the deaf person to know what you're saying. A better approach would be to clarify things beforehand, as previously mentioned, or to discreetly ask the interpreter to step outside the interview room. This also applies to any third party on the interviewing panel. The interpreter is obliged to interpret anything that a hearing person would normally hear, so any private conversations between the interviewing panel should also be resolved away from the deaf interviewee. So, to sum up, remember that the interpreter is not meant to be invisible or a translation machine. They are a third participant in the interview, albeit one whose only agenda is to make communication as easy as possible. And also remember that a little bit of preparation in a chat with the interpreter beforehand goes a long way to improving the productivity of the interview for all involved. Hopefully this DVD has helped you understand what having a sign language interpreter at an interview means, and what steps you can take to make things run smoothly. I'm Guy Manperson. Thank you for watching.